Let's start in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, now and forever, and to the ages of ages. Amen.
Good afternoon. My name is Father John Chrysavkis, and I would like first of all to announce that this afternoon's program is being live streamed and recorded, accessible and available on the social media of the St. Nicholas Shrine, both YouTube and Facebook, and on the website of the symposium. As the Deputy of His Eminence on the organizing committee of this historic conference, I have the great pleasure of presenting to you tonight's special event, which is the highlight of a 3-day international symposium entitled The Shape of the Sacred, Eastern Christianity and Architectural Modernity, generously sponsored by the Greek Orthodox Archdiocese of America in association with the Orthodox Christian Studies Center of Fordham University. On behalf of His Eminence Archbishop Elpidophoros of America, let me welcome all of you, reverend members of the clergy, eminent conference speakers and participants, as well as esteemed guests and visitors to this auspicious program. His Eminence is unfortunately away this evening, having been called to the Ecumenical Patriarchate for a session of the Holy Synod. But he is represented here by His Grace, Bishop Athenagoras, who will later convey to us the greeting and message of the Archbishop. But to begin, I would like to invite Father Andreas Vithulkas, who is our host as the presiding priest of this shrine, to offer a word of welcome.
Thank you, Father John. Your Graces, Reverend Fathers, dear friends, I would like to welcome you to this extraordinary and historic shrine of St. Nicholas, a Greek Orthodox church standing on the remains of the only house of worship destroyed on the fateful day of September 11th, at Ground Zero when the South Tower collapsed. The original St. Nicholas Greek Orthodox Church was built in 1916 and was located just a block away from the World Trade Center. The superb architecture and splendid iconography comprise a national pilgrimage for our entire nation. The building is designed by world-renowned Spanish architect Santiago Calatrava, whose innovative sculptural forms have earned him unprecedented worldwide recognition. It is the only church he has ever designed worldwide, making it a truly unique masterpiece. His design for St. Nicholas was inspired by the architectural elements of two major Byzantine monuments located in today's Istanbul: the 6th century cathedral of Hagia Sophia and the 11th century monastery of Our Savior in Chora. The exceptional icons are the creation of Father Luca of Xenophontos Monastery on Mount Athos, and of course, we are blessed to have His Grace Bishop Joachim of Amissus, who created the iconographic program here in the shrine. The icons are carefully crafted using traditional techniques and vibrant colors, bringing spiritual storytelling to life. The shrine houses the sacred relics of St. Nicholas brought by His All Holiness Ecumenical Patriarch Bartholomew from the city of Bari. I am delighted to have you here tonight and wish you a productive conference as well as a successful event this afternoon. Thank you.
And now, very briefly, for the benefit of those present who are not participating in the other conference sessions, I'd like to invite Inga Leonova, a member of the organizing committee, to offer a brief overview of the conference as it was conceived and as it was realized.
Thank you, Father John. I would like to say on behalf of the organizing committee that we're very honored and humbled by holding the central event of this three-day symposium in this incredible space. This conference that is called The Shape of the Sacred, Eastern Orthodoxy and Architectural Modernity was actually conceived out of the conversations that my co-organizer Joseph Clark and I, who are both architects, had that around the construction and realization of the project of St. Nicholas Shrine. So this project has been an inspiration for this symposium, which, as Father John has said, is really the first of its kind, dealing with theological, architectural, artistic, and other issues surrounding sacred space in the modern world. I would like, on behalf of the committee, to offer profound thanks, first of all, to His Eminence Archbishop Elpidiophoros and His Grace Bishop Athenagoras and the Greek Archdiocese, and also the Orthodox Studies Center at Fordham University for making this conference possible. Most of it is taking place at under the auspices of the Greek Archdiocese and Fordham on the campus of Fordham University at Lincoln Center. I would also like to thank the members of the organizing committee, most of whom I think are in this audience. The Deacon John Christoph Gies, Joseph Clark of University of Toronto, Nicholas Denisenko of the University of Valparaiso, Nathaniel Wood of Fordham University, Sergei Chupnin of Fordham University, and Peter Butenev of the Institute for Sacred Arts at St. Vladimir's Seminary, and Telly Aristotle Papanikolaou of Fordham University, who could not unfortunately be here today. He's traveling from Europe. And of course, profound thanks to all of our speakers and attendees at the conference. It was an incredible day and a half by now. Really, the conversations have been really very inspiring, and we're hoping for the continuation and the conclusion that would be just like the beginning. Thank you very much.
As I have already mentioned, we are very grateful to have with us Bishop Athenagoras of Nazianzos, whom I ask to address us on behalf of Archbishop Elpidiophoros. Your Grace.
Your Grace, Bishop Joachim of Amisos, Mr. Justin Davidson, architecture and classical music critic for the New York Magazine, esteemed speakers and presenters, respected members of the symposium's organizing committee, the Orthodox Christian Studies Center of Fordham University, the Friends of St. Nicholas, beloved parishioners of the St. Nicholas Shrine, honored guests, ladies and gentlemen. It is with great joy and a deep sense of gratitude to God that we are able to gather here this evening in the sacred national shrine of St. Nicholas at Ground Zero World Trade Center as part of this unique and most significant symposium, The Shape of the Sacred, Eastern Christianity and Architectural Modernity. This shrine itself is a witness to and emblem of this scholarly and spiritual dialogue. As all of you are aware, it has been only after many years of struggle that we have been able to arrive at the recent momentous events. The shrines Thyranixia, presided over by His All Holiness Ecumenical Patriarch Bartholomew, the consecration of the shrine on July 4th, and the full opening of the shrine and commencement of its regular liturgical life, beginning on the feast day of its great saintly patron on December 6th. Many individuals labored tirelessly for years to bring this holy undertaking to completion. New York State and city officials, the Greek Orthodox Archdiocese of America, the Friends of St. Nicholas, and their spiritual director, Father Alexander Karloutsos, and the parish members of St. Nicholas themselves. As I have said on previous occasions, it was our duty and our responsibility as Orthodox Christians, but also our obligation and commitment to God and His people to complete and open the doors of the St. Nicholas National Shrine. This rebuilt St. Nicholas Church is much more than the historic and precious parish church that was destroyed on 9/11, when so many innocent people lost their lives during that horrific attack and its resulting destruction. Rather, the St. Nicholas Shrine is a vision of what is best in all people of faith and religious conviction. Love of God and love of neighbor, mutual understanding, and reciprocal respect. As His All Holiness Ecumenical Patriarch Bartholomew of Constantinople had written concerning the rebirth of St. Nicholas, from the ashes of ground zero, the new church structure will arise like a glorious phoenix with hope in its wings. As the prophet Isaiah predicted so many centuries ago, I will give them glory for ashes. This shrine will be a place for all who come to the sacred and consecrated site at the World Trade Center, a place for them to imagine and envision a world where mercy is inevitable, reconciliation is desirable, and forgiveness is possible. This is the beauty of America, and this is the beauty of the St. Nicholas National Shrine. For although it is a Greek Orthodox house of worship, we welcome all, showing love for others, not prejudice, not rejection, and certainly not hatred. We are most honored to have as our keynote speaker this evening the Pulitzer Prize winner, Mr. Justin Davidson, New York Magazine's architecture and classical music critic, for which he writes about a wide range of urban, civic, and design issues. He is intimately familiar with and deeply knowledgeable of the urban landscape of New York, its history, and its ongoing transformation, and how these changes impact the city's inhabitants and visitors. This past December, Mr. Davidson, in an insightful review for the magazine, turned his keen analytical eye to the shrine of St. Nicholas at Ground Zero, the World Trade Center. This evening, we look forward to hearing his further comments and thought-provoking discussion regarding the shrine. It is in this setting of the World Trade Center, with its memorial pools, park, museum, transportation hub, and new towers, that we find Santiago Calatravas's architectural jewel of the Shrine of St. Nicholas. The design is a tribute to the glorious beauty and rich ecclesiastical heritage of Orthodox Christianity, drawing upon the great cathedral of Hagia Sophia in Constantinople, as well as acknowledging and expressing aspects of present realities and needs of 21st century architectural aesthetics, urban design, and the contemporary worship requirements of a living community of faith. It is an edifice of grandeur, yet presented on a human scale. The interior is adorned with iconography painted by the divinely inspired and very gifted iconographer, Father Lucas of the Xenophontos Monastery of Mount Athos. The holy images draw upon the centuries-long Byzantine iconographic tradition and style, while at the same time they have been adapted to present a unified visual topographical site-specific theme that pictorializes grief, remembrance, intercessory prayer, and the belief in rebirth, resurrection, and salvation. The architecture, the holy images, in concert with the ongoing liturgical celebrations and sacred chanting within the shrine, have harmoniously created an empsychos naos, a living or ensouled temple, a sacred space. This shrine, therefore, provides the ideal setting and focus for our gathering and symposium, dedicated to the advancement in our understanding of and investigation into the creation of sacred space. The St. Nicholas Shrine at Ground Zero World Trade Center is the context in which there is a mindful dialogue and exploration of the elements creating a holy site that antiphonally responds to traditional Orthodox architectural, iconographic, and liturgical expressions that are likewise able to inform and work in tandem with our 21st century contemporary challenges and needs. We must be mindful, however, that our goal is always to establish and maintain our link to the divine and transcendent. Such settings and sacred spaces as the Shrine of St. Nicholas present a liminal zone, opening for us the possibility of a transformative experience in which we can unite with the all-loving and merciful God. I would like to close my remarks by recalling one of the hymns chanted for the Matins of the Feast of St. Nicholas, the shrine's most wonderful and holy patron. A most excellent helper of those in tribulation, a comfort for them that mourn, a shepherd and guide for all the straying. O Nicholas, deliver us also from dangers by your intercessions. Thank you.
Thank you, Grace. And finally, it's a very special privilege for me to call on Joseph Clark, Associate Professor of Modern Architectural History at the University of Toronto, to introduce our distinguished speaker and to facilitate the premier segment of this evening's program. Joseph.
Sit down. Thank you very much, Your Grace. Thank you, Father John. My name is Joseph Clark. I am an Associate Professor of Architectural History at the University of Toronto. And I'm very excited to be able to present this evening's keynote conversation with Justin Davidson. We've conceived the event this evening as a conversation format, so as soon as my batteries are changed, I will be sitting here and I will introduce Mr. Davidson. Thank you. All right, I am fully powered up now. And I'm delighted to introduce Justin Davidson, who, as we've heard, is the architecture and classical music critic for New York Magazine. Born and raised in Rome, which is something that I hope we get to talk about, where he wrote for the Associated Press, Davidson came to the United States to study music at Harvard and Columbia. He actually became an award-winning composer and then folded his interest in composition back into his vocation for writing, becoming a classical music critic, and eventually becoming an architecture critic as well. He has written for many publications, including the New York Times Book Review, the New Yorker, Smithsonian, the Los Angeles Times, and Slate. In 2002, he was the recipient of the Pulitzer Prize for Criticism. And in addition to all of this writing, he's also the author of the book, Magnetic City, A Walking Companion to New York. So we're really thrilled to have you here with us tonight. You are a longtime observer of New York architecture, and in particular, you have witnessed the whole process of rebuilding the World Trade Center, from 9/11 itself, the discussions that began almost immediately about what the sort of shape the rebuilding should take, the various debates, the various designs that were proposed, and one by one, the buildings being finished. And so tonight, we are sitting here in St. Nicholas, the only religious building at the World Trade Center. And I wonder if you could just start by maybe speaking about what has struck you or what has surprised you about witnessing this process and finally seeing the church completed.
Yeah, thank you for the invitation and for your introduction. It's a real thrill to be here. And I was thinking as I was crossing from the subway across the plaza to come here, and I was remembering what it was like 22 years ago. And just, if you were here, you remember the gloom, the destruction, the workers pulling vehicles and chunks of buildings out of the site and carting them away, the smell, the quality of the air. It's something I'll certainly never forget. I don't think anybody who was here could possibly forget it. And I was trying to imagine if some spirit had been able to tell me, to sort of give me a vision of what it's like today, whether I would have believed it, because there's just, you know, it's a day, that sort of warm, soft air of today, this beautiful spring day, is actually not that dissimilar from the weather on that Tuesday in September. And so it brings back all kinds of physical memories. But in terms of, I was thinking also about the role of this religious building here. And let me backtrack a little bit, if you don't mind. So we're sitting on a pivot point in New York. To the east is the oldest part of the city, New Amsterdam. If you go to Stuyvesant Square, right across from the Staten Island Ferry, there is a 3D model of a famous map called the Castello map, which is a 1660 plan of New Amsterdam, which was then redesigned in 1916. And that version of it, which was cited in Russell Shorto's book about New York, an island at the center of the world, is mapped out in 3D. And it's an incredible map because you can see exactly every square foot of New York. It's like there's a famous map of Rome called the Noli map. This is sort of like the Noli map of New Amsterdam. It tells you who was living where, what taverns there were. And you can see the density of houses, wooden houses, right next to the only pier, which was in the East River. and then the fort at the Battery, and then the coastline on the west side where there really wasn't anything. You can see as it moves west and north, it becomes the suburbs, and then there's a wall at Wall Street and the agricultural areas. And New Amsterdam was explicitly founded as a capitalist enterprise. Right? It was a company town. The point of New York was to make money. That was what it was for, always has been. From here to the west was water or marsh. Right? We are sitting, I'm not sure exactly where that line is, but part of the site of the World Trade Center is landfill. So that part of the island of Manhattan didn't even exist. So we are basically at the juncture of the oldest and the newest parts of New York City. And that was where that destruction happened. That had significant meaning because when it came time to build the memorial and dig down in, keeping the water out was a significant engineering challenge. But when it came time to rebuild what was, after all, the World Trade Center, so an extension of the Dutch West India Company and that mission in the world, it was a very different project. In other words, it became about integrating not only the oldest and newest parts of the city, solid land and marsh and landfill, but also what I think came to be seen in a general way, and I don't mean this literally, a juncture of the sacred and the profane. Because the memorial was conceived from the beginning as a place of collection, of commemoration, of contemplation, a certain sacredness, non-denominational, ecumenical sacredness. But it was always clear that it was going to be surrounded by towers similar in function to the World Trade Center towers, and that it had to be connected to the city beyond. So I was thinking about exactly that. As I walked from the subway station, I passed not only the Oculus, the PATH station that Santiago Calatrava designed, but right next to it is a beer garden. And I just, if somebody had said, yeah, 20 years from now, you'll be walking past a beer garden on your way to the rebuilt church, across the memorial, in between all those towers, that would have been hard to contemplate. But I think that's how you have to understand this seam, this kind of like border zone, is really that negotiation between that which is sort of endemic to New York, that is the profane world of business and commerce and crowds and entertainment and all of that, and this kind of commemorative, contemplative zone that extends to here, to an explicitly religious building, but also sort of spiritually out into the plaza.
Absolutely. And what's always struck me about Lower Manhattan is how so many different programs come together and are almost piled on top of each other. And the physical fabric of the city has to reconcile so many different functions. So just to pick up on this idea that you mentioned about the larger function of the memorial and its relationship to the explicitly sacred building of this church. It struck me that very soon after 9/11, almost immediately, the language of the sacred was being invoked. Politicians, planners, designers began talking about the site of the Twin Towers as a kind of sacred ground, and explicitly using this language that word to bring legitimacy to the rebuilding effort and to help mobilize all of the machinery of government and of private capital. And it surprised me a little bit to hear it spoken of that way, because of course the 9/11 hijackers claimed the mantle of religion for what they were doing. But it struck me that when people are confronted with catastrophe and death on that scale, there's a kind of almost instinctive turn to the idea of the sacred.
Go ahead.
The master planner of the Trade Center site, Daniel Libeskind, told a story in his putting forward his design about how he went down into the foundations. You mentioned the concrete foundations that kind of hold back the water for the World Trade Center. And Libeskind talks about descending to the bedrock and touching the wall and then coming back up and wanting visitors to the site to have this experience of descent, commemorating the tragedy that occurred here, and then ascending and having a kind of a hope for new life. And this, again, is very religious imagery. This is looks to me like a very Christian kind of symbolism. So again, remarkable that this is being invoked in the design of the memorial. So I wonder if that strikes you as well, and you know, if you have any thoughts on why such a kind of religiously inflected symbolic language might have such resonance in the design here.
Yeah, that's a really good point. There are so many ironies embedded in what you just said. I mean, obviously, yes, the fanatical religiosity of the people who committed the attacks in the first place in the name of religion. So New York historically was one of the distinctive places in New York, in the colonies, that were founded absent a kind of religious motivation, right? It was not Boston, it was not places farther south. It was not founded by a religious community at all. And in fact, it was always explicitly tolerant. There were many religions represented in New Amsterdam and then the early days of English New York from the very beginning. And to some extent, I think that was represented in the period you were talking about. Yes, Daniel Libeskind had a kind of spiritual cast to the way he talked about the site. Daniel Libeskind is Jewish. He was the architect of the Jewish, what's the name of it? It's not the Holocaust Memorial. That was
The Jewish Museum.
Jewish Museum in Berlin, which is, of course, not a religious building, but has a strong spiritual component. He talked about America in sort of quasi-religious terms. His whole rhetoric at the time, he became famous for being the master planner here, was about arriving from Poland, seeing the Statue of Liberty almost as a kind of religious icon, entering the harbor, you know, something that his and my ancestors did in an earlier phase. He was already coming in the age of plane travel, and yet he arrived by ship and he talked about it that way, or at least he talked about it that way. I assume he also arrived by ship. And so there are all those layers of his experience. The designer of the memorial, Michael Arad, is also Jewish, also sort of an architect with a spiritual cast who talked about it in spiritual terms, as is appropriate for the design of the memorial. But these were not explicitly religious conversations. They were a kind of generalized sense of commemoration and a sense that anything you built here had a kind of spiritual association, in however vague that term actually was. Now, the interesting thing about what you started out by saying, which was that the site of the buildings themselves were discussed as sacred ground from the beginning. I see that as an explicitly political move. In other words, the first people to say that were a couple of family members, who, after all, remember, were unable to retrieve the remains of their family members because it was simply a communal gravesite and it was impossible to separate the once animate from the inanimate. And so there was a sense that everything had kind of come together in this great act of fire and compression, carbonization. And so they asserted, instantly, almost within days, asserted a certain kind of moral authority over the rebuilding of the site by invoking that language. They took possession of it morally. This is my husband's place of death, my husband's grave, and you shall not build it became kind of a commandment. It became a commandment because the governor of New York, George Pataki, said it should. And he had the authority, and he had the authority explicitly because the site was owned by the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey, which he controlled. So I think we have to distinguish the kind of grandeur of the emotions from the political specificities that made these things happen. That was a real ingredient from the beginning. And what that meant in practical terms was that you had two large squares of space, each the size of a New York City, each side the length of a New York City block, twice, that were declared off limits to construction. Now, when you think just about the fact that New York is propelled by real estate, and everything in New York is calculated in terms of square footage, that was a massive decision to create a zone of emptiness, a void, in the center of the densest part of the city. And I didn't think it would work, but it did.
Well, you, I think, are alluding to the way that the claims of the sacred can be contested, and claims of sacred space can also become entangled with politics, with different kinds of narratives. And inevitably at the World Trade Center, claims of the sacrality of the memorials become entangled with narratives of nationalism, narratives of commerce, because this is a World Trade Center. It seems to me that one thing that St. Nicholas might contribute as an explicitly sacred building, as a church on this site, is to provide a kind of outlet for that instinct to sacralize and that need for spaces to memorialize and to grieve, that puts it into an explicitly theological and liturgical context. And in that sense may may take a bit of the burden off the memorial and the museum and the other spaces at this site.
You know, I think it certainly does that for the organized religion here, for the congregation, for the people who come into the building. I think it has a slightly different function as a presence in the city, in two ways, maybe three. One is that from the beginning, the site was, and by site I mean basically everything from, I guess, Liberty Street up to Fulton, well, one block on either side, and then from West Street to Church Street, I guess, Broadway. So it's a large 16-acre site, and the kind of the perimeter of that, and other buildings that had been destroyed, even across the damage that was done across West Street at what was then the World Financial Center, and that is now called Brookfield Place. So that site was always understood in a kind of three-dimensional matrix, we're talking urbanistically, of the street grid. So one of the earliest principles was to bring Fulton Street back through the site, because the World Trade Center itself was on an elevated superblock platform that was really quite separate from the rest of the city. You had to climb up to it, and it interrupted the modern grid of New York, and certainly the original sort of almost medieval grid of New York. So part of that was to kind of knit the site back together with the rest of the city. And then a kind of vertical matrix too, which was the sense that the towers had created this presence on the skyline. So repairing the skyline was one big responsibility. And the other was, as the towers had collapsed, they created this crater, and that crater needed to be recognized. So the memorials were a sort of penetrating down into bedrock, and this idea of bedrock, the word kept coming up. That was sort of the base of what was underneath all those buildings was bedrock. A lot of it is actually just marsh, but there is this kind of idea of New York being built on this seam of granite, which is partially true. But those holes, those voids, the idea of the water and memories and sort of darkness flowing down into those holes was powerful, as a contrast to the verticality of the 1,776-foot tall One World Trade Center, and then the somewhat the stepwise descent of other towers around it. So this building is also, as I said, it's at a pivot point between the oldest and newest parts of New York, between the sacred and the profane. It's also a kind of node between those two vertical and horizontal, thrusts and the horizontal matrix. And it's the one building this sort of one of two buildings really, along with the Performing Arts Center, that is at a kind of, not a domestic scale, obviously it's bigger than a house, but at a kind of scale where you can take in the vertical extent of it just by looking at it all at once. In other words, with most towers, you cannot see the top and the bottom in one glance, because if you get close, you can't see the top, and if you get farther away, you can see the top, but then you can't see the bottom. But this church, you can see the whole thing, the top and the bottom at the same time. That's true of the Performing Arts Center. And that, I think, is a really qualitatively different thing about this building. It's unusual in New York in general, because it's also freestanding. It's surrounded by air on all four sides. It's also on a podium, like the original World Trade Center was, but this podium is different in that it was one of the first viewing platforms for the destroyed site. This was where family members would come early on at one point. It moved around, but to look down onto the site. So it provided a vantage point. And I think in all those ways, it acts as a kind of like transitional point. What I'm not sure I buy is the idea that it urbanistically, outside this group or this room, really has that sort of explicitly religious function in the city. But it does do what churches, especially in Europe, often do, which is shape the space around it, or shape the perception of the space around it in a way that goes beyond its actual scale, and in a way that towers, large towers, have a very hard time doing. But churches do.
And why can churches do that better than towers?
Well, towers, like the One World Trade Center, they can't do it for the reason I mentioned before, which is that you can't experience the whole building all at once. When you're standing close to a tower, whether it's 200 feet, 600 feet, or 1,700 feet tall, really doesn't make any difference. You can't see beyond the first 150 feet, or you can't really experience it. So all you do is sense that you're close to a tall building, but the actual vertical dimension doesn't matter. And then because so many towers, especially these days, are glass, I find that glass makes a very poor perimeter for public space. It's very bad at defining what a public space is and feels like. Compare that to, say, virtually any piazza in Italy, any place in France, many of which are defined by a church and then the perimeter buildings. But it doesn't have to be a church. I mean, the Plaza Mayor in Salamanca is one of the great public spaces in the world, and it's a series, or Place des Vosges in Paris, it's a series of stone buildings that, because of their scale and the way that you access them, create a kind of really ideal enclosure. But what churches do especially, I mean, you mentioned that I grew up in Rome. What churches can do is act as a kind of pivot, as a focus for the space around it. And there is one particular that I'm thinking of, which it's not an exact analogy to what happens here, but I think it illustrates the principle. In Rome, there's a church called Santa Maria della Pace. It's a small church near Piazza Navona. And it was built in the 15th century, but then reconfigured in the 17th century with a new facade. And if you approach it, it feels like you're in a wide street that approaches the facade diagonally, It then forks going on either side through arches. In order to create that, it was really created as a place for carriages to turn around because it was basically a dead end. So it was kind of a vehicular, defined by vehicles in the same way that suburban streets are defined by the turning radius of a fire truck. This was like in order for carriages to be able to turn around. But the thing is that, so in order to create that facade, they had to remove some houses. And the illusion is that it forks like a stream around the church. In fact, it doesn't. There's one archway that does. It's a very narrow alleyway, and the other one dead ends. It's an illusion from the facade of the church. But as soon as you turn the corner and you're facing it, what you see is a boulevard leading to the church, and then you experience the facades of all the buildings as an extension of those wings. Now, it's a different kind of layout here, but I think that even in a relatively small building like this, the towers that we have on either ends, on the four corners, reflect the verticality of the towers all around it. And for instance, if you stand at the front, and I think if you're looking that way, there's some very tall buildings across the street that fade into insignificance, because what you see is the much smaller but stronger tower of this building that reflects the verticality of all the buildings around it, but actually manages to overshadow perceptually buildings that are much taller and much bigger than this one.
And do you think that that's partly because, so part of it has to do with the scale, that because the building is a smaller scale, it is actually easier it's a bit more comprehensible as a unified entity within the city. I wonder if also there's a way in which a church is able to claim a certain kind of rhetorical authority or maybe moral authority within the urban design, even potentially for people who aren't members of that particular parish, but it has a kind of presence that other buildings, vernacular structures around it maybe don't lay claim to.
Yes, because it's instantly recognizable as something that is distinct from the rest of the world. It's separate, right? It is white, it is stone, it is curved, its dimensions are unlike anything else around it. Its low arch is inviting and very distinctive. It's really not like anything else you see. It's clearly institutional, but it's not like the Oculus. It's clearly not a transportation hub. It can, in a way, only be one thing, and you can perceive that as soon as you look at it. And so it's like a bell. Thank you. It dings. Yes. And of course, at night when it glows, it does that even more so. But it's unmissable in a way that a massive glass building is not.
Fascinating. I'd like to ask you about the architect, Santiago Calatrava. You mentioned that he not only designed this building, but also designed the transit hub, the Oculus building just down the street. And I don't know, some people who came down here by public transit may have come up through that building on their way to St. Nicholas. Santiago Calatrava is an architect who was also trained as a civil engineer. He had never, as His Grace mentioned, he had never designed a church before he designed this building. And so, in some ways, it may have been a bit surprising that he was chosen to design not one, but two civic buildings at the World Trade Center. I'm curious if you have any thoughts on maybe how this particular architect was able to capture the imagination of New Yorkers to be asked to design these two very prominent buildings.
When I saw this building, my sense was, and I had talked to him a number of times and written about the Oculus and some other buildings, but when I saw this one, I thought, right, this guy is a religious architect waiting to get out. He was kind of in camouflage his whole life, and finally he managed to do the thing that he was really supposed to be doing all along. There just isn't that much work for somebody, at least on that scale. I think the thing about Calatrava, the thing that has made him both famous and also controversial, is that he brings a kind of humanistic and I suppose you would say spiritual ethic to infrastructure. You know, he builds bridges, he builds bus stations, he builds the things that are meant to be, that are meant to disappear into the fabric, that are meant to be useful but not particularly attention-getting, that are meant to sort of cost as little as possible and do a lot of complicated tasks. And he has turned all of those tasks on their head. So instead of being a transitional thing from a transitional facility from one side of a river or one road to another, his bridges become destinations. His train stations become sort of cathedral-like. He turns each one of those things into a kind of focal point. And that is, has created a lot of distinctive architecture. It's a very expensive process. He pushes engineering sometimes to uncomfortable degrees. Sometimes there is failure involved. So there have been quite a lot of challenges, technical challenges in the construction of his buildings, financial challenges, and also, you know, there've been some lawsuits about, you know, leaking buildings and so on. So it's not an easy history. And of course, the Oculus is most famous for having cost $4 billion. But I think that when you look at the way, at least here, these two buildings function, there was a sense, to go back to the beginning of, you know, what people wanted from the World Trade Center site, there was a strong sense, and I think it was a public sense as well as a sort of expert sense, that this site should not be business as usual. That it should not just kind of grow over like moss and just become a part of New York City that was like everything else. That it had to have a kind of meaningful moral and architectural distinction. And the reality was that the architecture of the towers was always going to have a very hard time achieving that because they were fundamentally formulaic commercial buildings, even though you could create some twist to that. But there really are within some strong limits. His design for the station was one of the only, ironically at the beginning, one of the only uncontested designs. Nobody objected. It seemed right from the very beginning. It seemed like it answered that call. It created something special out of something that didn't need to be special. In other words, it was better than it needed to be. And I think that's what some people were looking for. Now, the fact that that became difficult to achieve and expensive to achieve became another story of its own. But I think that it makes sense to me that there is an explicitly religious building and a kind of para-religious transportation hub that are in direct contact with each other, even though on completely different scales.
In a moment, I will invite questions from the audience, but before we get to that, while we're on the discussion about Calatrava and his design sensibility, one thing that really strikes me about this church is the scale of the detail. We talked about the scale of the overall building. It's not trying to compete in terms of size with the towers around it. It's really trying to do something different, and one way that the architect has tried to achieve that is with the level of detail. And I'm curious if you, as an architecture critic, might pick out some detail. We're sitting here in this church. Is there a detail that you might draw our attention to where you feel that Calatrava has done something really remarkable with the building?
Could I just talk a little bit before picking out a detail about what detail means in this building and why it's important?
Please.
As a student of modernism, you know that detail has had a hard time, and ornamentation has had a hard time asserting itself over the course of the last 100+ years. And if you look around New York and if you look around the site, what you see is that commercial large-scale buildings avoided. Originally, perhaps, for stylistic and ideological reasons, but also for practical ones. It's very hard to detail something on such a large scale. Any building, any commercial building, which is value engineered to within an inch of its life, has to, by definition, practically, absorb, sort of plug into a supply chain of materials, facade panels from China, glass from Germany, and so on. All of which are basically preconceived, prefabricated, and produced on a scale where fundamentally the smallest detail unit is kind of, I think of it as the size of a refrigerator, right? It's basically, you have these modules that get repeated. But anything smaller than that is a frill. It's considered a frill, and in practice it is because it doesn't actually mean anything. It's just a decorative accent. Now, when you get to a building like this, it is imperative for the significance of the building that your relationship to surfaces be one of eye to eye and hand to hand, because there's a kind of physicality that is part of the religious experience and embedded into the meaning. These icons are narrative, they are full of religious significance, they're full of tradition. Certain figures, certain gestures get repeated in familiar ways over the centuries, techniques get adapted. So, you know, whether it's the Greek crosses perforated in the marble of the door, the hardware on the doors that echo it, the grapevine motifs that go up and down the columns that cover every surface. The distinction between those carved surfaces and the smooth marble, the translucent panels in the dome that allow light to come in and on the side. And one thing that I mentioned to you before is these arches that frame the recesses. For a civil engineer, the whole training is to be as efficient as possible. So that if you look at the station, those ribs, each one of those has a structural purpose, and it's designed to be efficient. So these are steel arches that are clad in marble. There's 1, 2, 3, 4. But if you look at them, they serve no function. They are completely freestanding. They don't support any weight. They are tied back by thin metal posts. And so they are, in a sense, large-scale ornaments. That's what they're there for. What they do is define the space more precisely. They're kind of like calligraphic. They draw the space. They create a little depth in a small room so that they intimate that there's, because of the lighting and because of the translucent panels, they intimate that there's a space on the other side, which there isn't, where it's very narrow. So they kind of give you a slight suggestion of depth, which is an illusionistic one, but it's reflected in, say, the architecture that you see in the iconography. So I think it echoes, for instance, the sort of perspective of the arches in that baldaquino, in that gazebo. So I'm fond of those. John, I know you used to work for the architecture firm SOM. That is full of people who would frown on that kind of
Indeed.
extraneous use of steel and stone.
Yes, absolutely. Well, that's terrific. And I think on that note, we have a few minutes, I should say, for questions. Father John is...
So if I can just announce that Inga will be bearing the microphone. Think of it as functional, not decorative. Think of her as a deacon with a candle. That's the closest we can get right now. We need you to ask your questions into the microphone because we're recording, we're live streaming, and we want to make sure we can capture the question as well as the response.
Thank you.
Thank you so very much for this presentation. I do apologize for being late, but New York traffic being as it is, it's no surprise to anyone. I'm curious, having listened to your presentation, for which I thank you, as to what your take is on Calatrava's own explanation about using the Orthodox theology of architecture by taking the icon of the Platitera Uranu, the Mother of God, with her arms outspread, and making the interior of the church resemble the womb of the Virgin Mary, and every feature is to be rounded off. There are no pointed features whatsoever, and hence the arch which keeps the eye going up and coming down again. This is the kingdom of heaven that you've entered into. This space, you have to go no further in this space. I personally think that he succeeded very well, but that which I find unusual, and perhaps it's the setting that it's in and what you talked about, the very purpose of its being here, for me, it seems to combine the elements not only of the womb, for the Theotokos, which is essential to our architecture, but also the feeling of being inside a tomb. So to me, it's womb and tomb at the same time, but yet the translucent marble, the sheathing of the marble, offers you light, and so that it's not a dead end, as it were, but it's a place where there's hope, which is offered in that. And just one comment, since you brought up the iconography rather, whenever I have to deal with iconographers who are going to fresco my church interiors, I get incredibly frustrated if they do not allow the walls to speak to them before they start putting their work on the walls, instead of trying to force something onto it. And so I think that here we also have success, and I'd like to hear your comments on the same. Thank you.
I mean, I would love to know what you mean by that. It's gotten worse. The walls, allowing the walls to speak. Can you just tell me what that? Can we have the microphone back? I just asked the question or a question.
Thank you. What I mean is the following. Many churches have walls which are not your traditional walls. And if somebody tries to force apply Orthodox iconography to those walls without taking into consideration the configuration of the walls themselves and how they can apply them. And I think what he managed to do here is, by allowing the walls to speak, he was able to put in the icons and yet leave incredible amounts of space to complement the airiness of the church and the translucency of the marble. And I think that that's a rare feature, because I was personally concerned when I saw the original take of the Christ Pantocrator. It was very traditional, and it didn't fit the interior at all. It's been since replaced, which is good, but these icons have managed to fit in here, and I think that they complement the architecture instead of taking away from the architecture.
I mean, it's hard for me to speak to the meanings, the explicitly religious meanings of the architecture. What strikes me in what you said and in Calatrava's design are, first of all, that you mentioned that it was important for the iconographer to kind of let the walls speak. I think it was important and unusual for Calatrava to think in terms of walls, right? If you look at the oculus, that is pure structure separated by glass. Now, there's a reason for that. Originally, it was much less structure and much more glass. For security reasons, that had to be thickened. But what he has always conceived is that these really transparent structures in which the buildings and infrastructure in which the structure itself is eloquent. He's never really, I don't know that there's a history of him creating these surfaces to then be adorned, or this opacity that then needs to be offset by translucence. That's quite different from the way he's operated in the past. So I think what he needed to do, aside from finding the sort of specific reference points to Greek Orthodox architecture and iconography, to do a round church. Obviously has a long history and multiple traditions. But he needed to do it in a way that made sense to him as an architect. But I think since we were talking about the way the building relates both internally and externally to the rest of the site, those curves that you mentioned are part of what makes that church really distinct, because this is a place of sharp edges, right? Every other building is like these completely angular, smooth planes. The goal is, architects talk in terms of taut facades and tight corners, right? 90 degrees is always 90 degrees, but in modernism, it's like there are differences, and those lines and everything has to be perfect. And of course, the torque on the one world trade that creates these chamfered angles, creates a slightly different profile, even though it's a simple geometric operation, but it's still just simply more faceted. So the fact that this building has these kind of sensual curves sets it off. But the other thing is that I mentioned the term value engineering, which in commercial architecture is always the process of whittling away all of the frills, getting down to the essence, so that you're not paying for anything more than you absolutely have to. Getting a curved marble shape is expensive and wasteful in material terms, right? That's a lot of stone that you just throw away because you have to take it off. So its curve is not just contrasting because it's curved, but also because it's kind of anti-value engineering. And that's a technical observation, but I think it's one of those things that you just observe almost subconsciously. You walk by here and your eye is drawn to something that doesn't look like anything else. Why? Well, it could be because the metaphoric interpretation you have as the relationship of womb and tomb and the opacity. But I think it's also just that sense of a building that serves a very different function from everything else on the site.
Thank you very much indeed. There's a way I think that perhaps one could say that it is in the providence of God that this particular church is a Greek Orthodox church, a national shrine, rather than many other possible kinds of churches. Right? In a way, it's a product of the history of this particular site. But it strikes me also that this church can do because it is a Greek Orthodox church, it can do certain things that other kinds of churches could not do. And I look at you sitting there with the imagery behind you that, for example, a Protestant church would not, or maybe could not do well. Maybe this is an unfair question, but do you find yourself dwelling on that which a Greek Orthodox church specifically can do for this site that other kinds of churches could not do? Do you see what I'm asking?
I honestly hadn't thought in those terms, but I see what you mean. I think it's worth remembering how fraught the question of specific religious institutions has been on this site from the very beginning, right? There was a design for a small Islamic center. There are masjids, Islamic centers all over the city. There's a large mosque on the Upper East Side. There are focal points for the community. When there was a design for a small building to replace, I believe it was to replace an Islamic center that was on one floor of a building that was destroyed, that became hugely controversial. It was instantly politicized. So in that sense, I think by being outside some of those, by being separate from some of those political fault lines, I think that's true. There was a Greek Orthodox church here. Replacing it in and of itself was not controversial, perhaps because it's not one of the main streams of American Christianity or American religion. It's, so I don't know the answer to that. But what I think you're getting at, or at least what registers with me, is the fact that you can have, first of all, a round-playing church, which has that history, and a church that can say one thing to the exterior and something slightly different at the interior that is so pure in a way, so almost sort of sugar cube-like in its outward-facing manifestation, and so richly decorated and traditional and interior inside. And so I think it's a kind of process of discovery, which you don't, again, I'm just sort of thinking about its role on the site, you don't get that anywhere else, right? When you go into the lobby of One World Trade or any of these office buildings, you pretty much get the lobby that you're gonna expect. When you go into the station, it's spectacular, but your experience of it has been foreshadowed by what's outside, right? You kind of understand what's inside from standing outside. In this building, that's not true at all. So there is a process of discovery and coming to that that's from here. And then just to, in practical terms, the iconography that then allows for the view of the city and the church and the site right above the altar is very distinctive, and it gives a sense of how the site itself and the city itself behaves in the kind of conception of the church. Yes, certainly Protestant churches, and perhaps, and again, I'm speculating here because this is really not my area of expertise at all, but I think that the fact that it can be so powerful at this scale is really important. In other words, it's a national shrine, but it's not a cathedral. It doesn't have to have the presence of, say, St. Patrick's or the Cathedral of Our Angels in Los Angeles. It doesn't. In order for it to have that importance, it doesn't need to be on that scale. I don't know whether that's something that's distinctive to Greek Orthodox churches, but it is specific to here.
I wonder if I could follow up on that question. In our symposium, we've been looking at a number of examples of 20th century church designs of various kinds, engagements of modern architecture with ecclesiastical design. We looked at some churches by Tadao Ando. We looked at the cathedral in Los Angeles, the Roman Catholic Cathedral. But in contrast to some of these churches, it seems to me Orthodox Christianity is very much a faith that uses and venerates images as part of worship. And Orthodox Church must have icons. And icons have to go on wall surfaces. And so this gets back to the point about that this was, despite being designed by an architect who doesn't build a lot of walls, this church needed to have walls. And it needed to be ornamented with icons. So it seems to me that Calatrava brought a lot of his own design sensibility to this church, but it was also for this architect who's not himself Orthodox, a process of his own kind of discovering and engaging with a certain tradition, and then working with his client and working with the iconographer, and a whole kind of process of which the outcome was not a foregone conclusion.
And I would suspect that for somebody who, really was kind of brought up reared on 20th century modernism of a certain kind, but also, the study of classical ruins, which he interpreted, not in their polychrome originality, their original polychrome versions, but kind of as the pure white versions that have been handed down through just the operations of weather and time. and how we experience them today, these kind of like, so that these buildings like the Oculus are kind of like, have that skeletal quality that classical ruins have. But, this is somebody who also is in touch with the painted part of antiquity, the frescoes at Pompeii, and is Spanish. And he comes from a tradition of incredibly ornamented walls and doorways and grills. And not something he was ever really able to express in his architecture before, but he had that, I think, in his background. Question over here.
So we have time for one more question.
Earlier in our discussions in the symposium, we were talking about how this building serves double function. And
I'm sorry, say that again?
how this building serves a double function.
Double.
It belongs both to a community of believers, which is a religious and ethnic community, but now it also is a kind of offering to the city of New York, in a sense. And so I'm wondering, what features, if any, do you think make the design of this church particularly inviting for non-Christians even to come and experience it as a sacred space? And if so, what can church architecture in the West in general learn from this kind of, let's call it, outreaching design, which invites people in who would not be in a church space like this otherwise?
That's a very interesting question. I mean, my experience is that religious buildings can be simultaneously exclusionary and inviting. I was recently at the main Hindu temple in Queens, and I was not familiar with it. I wound up there because I went to the canteen that's in the basement where they have an Indian, it was wonderful, Indian cafeteria, which is a focal point for the community. And then I went upstairs, and I was hesitant to go in because I don't know what the practices are, and I didn't know how welcome I would be. It turned out I was very welcome to wander around. And so I experienced the architecture in a very direct way as both inviting. It's like the doors were open, just come on in, and somebody kind of waved me in. And also kind of like, this is not you, this is different. There are codes of behavior that the architecture suggests, only it's not explicit, so you don't actually know what they are. And I think that's always a tricky thing. So it's not just the architecture, it's also the way it's managed and operated. One of the things that I think is inviting about this building is its mystery, right? When it's mysterious, you want to approach and see what it is. And its mystery is partly in the fact that it is, again, simultaneously translucent, especially at night, visibly, a source of light, but also opaque, right? You can't see inside, and you don't know what it is. And I contrast that with the rhetoric around glass. You've heard me say about glass, as a way of defining public space and how poor it can be at that. I find particularly weak the metaphoric interpretations of glass as open, inviting, transparent, democratic. Two things in particular make me think of that. One is the glass dome that Norman Foster designed for the Reichstag in Berlin, which was meant to be an explicitly open, democratic signifier for a place with a difficult political history. And Renzo Piano's New York Times building, which was, with its glass facade, which was meant to, in his mind, suggest the kind of openness and transparency of a news gathering operation. I find both of those uses of glass metaphorically completely generic. Glass gets used to pile up bottles of detergent in front of it. It doesn't, what matters is what happens behind the glass. Just the fact of glass. When you have glass, for instance, and residences along the High Line or along the west side, some of the original glass apartment buildings at Perry Street and Charles Street, designed by Richard Meyer, which are these sort of exhibitionistic wonders. You can like look inside. The fact is that people pull curtains over them. Or if they're getting undressed, they go into another room. They're actually, that glass becomes an interference. It's not actually as open in its uses. It's not significant it doesn't signify any of those things. So the idea that glass is in itself kind of inviting, open, transparent, all of those things, is to me deceptive. It's a rhetorical trick. And in fact, when you come to a building like this and you see that there is light glowing inside, that there is a big archway, but that you're not actually sure what happens, that is an invitation to penetrate it, to move inside and see what's going on. And I think that is something, what's interesting about churches when you're traveling, for instance, is an open door and something, a glint, something that you see inside that you may not fully understand, and you want to go through it. And sometimes you wind up in a cloister or a courtyard or in the nave of a church. And that, I think, is part of what distinguishes this building and, much religious architecture from everything else.
Well, that's really a perfect note to end on, and I'd really like to thank you, Justin, for helping us to look at this building and to understand its place in the city of New York and also its place within the practice of contemporary architecture in a much richer way. So please join me in thanking Justin Davidson.
Well, thank you. Thank you.